Hey everybody, my name is Lee Brinkman, and in this video I'm going to discuss everything that you need to know about the baking ingredient yeast within bread and other baked goods. So here I have my local grocery store's generic brand of active dry yeast, which is a baking yeast, and this yeast is used as a leavening agent in bread and other bakery products. Now, there are various different forms of baker's yeast, but active dry yeast, like the one that I have here, is the most commonly available to non-commercial bakers. It consists of coarse oblong granules of yeast with live yeast cells encapsulated in a thin jacket of dry dead cells. So now let me just really quickly cut open one of these packets so you can see exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to the shape. Each of these packets, I believe, has 1/4 of an ounce in it. Yes. So usually your recipe will call for 1 packet, 2 packet, however much that you may need. So cutting it open, I'll pour it into this little dish I have here. But you'll see, if I can show you closely enough, that there are these little granules that essentially they're just covered in that thick, dry, dead cell coating so that they can be used when you desire them to be used. Now, under most conditions, active dry yeast must first be rehydrated, which is actually explained on the back of this packet, where it talks about dissolving them into hot water, which this gets rid of that excess coating of those dead cells. And this yeast can be stored at room temperature for up to a year. So on this packet, I bought it on February 18th, 2014. However, this can be used all the way up until September 2016. Or I'm sorry, 2015 on there. So it does last for a long time if you store it at room temperature in a cool, dark place. And if frozen, you can actually store this for more than a decade, which this means that this type of active dry yeast has better keeping qualities than any other forms of yeast. But it's generally considered more sensitive to thermal shock when actually used in recipes, which I'll touch on later in the video. Yeast is actually a eukaryotic organism that falls under the fungi kingdom. So essentially it's a fungus. They're 95% unicellular, and as a result, many of them reproduce asexually through mitosis. Now, there are a ton of different species of yeast, as I mentioned earlier, and all these strands vary in individual size and certain properties. Most yeasts are actually toxic to the human body. However, there are a few strands that are extremely helpful in the production of food and drink items, mainly beer and bread. This is done through a process called fermentation, in which the yeast performs a chemical reaction converting sugar into energy, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. The fermentation process of yeast in bread comes as a result of the enzymes found in a bread dough that digest the flour starch and turn it into maltose, which is a type of malt sugar. The yeast then consumes the maltose to fuel the chemical reaction and ultimately produce carbon dioxide. Now, with this active dry yeast, in order to activate it, in the traditional method, you actually will add a teaspoon of sugar with the hot water, which then the sugar is used as energy for the yeast to complete the fermentation process. Now, one species in particular, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the scientific name for either brewer's yeast or baker's yeast, which is what I have here, converts carbohydrates into carbon dioxide and alcohols, which specifically is the process of fermentation we just discussed previously, which is used in the creation of beer, wine, and bread. This particular strand of yeast uses glucose and converts it into energy through either aerobic respiration or anaerobic fermentation, which is a very unique ability since most yeast cannot perform in an oxygen-deficient environment. In addition, baker's yeast also has the ability to reproduce both asexually and sexually. As a result of all these unique characteristics and adaptations, this type of yeast can survive in many different environments and has been one of the most commonly used forms of yeast since ancient baking times. Baker's yeast and yeast in general are extremely temperamental. When storing yeast, you want to keep it at a temperature where it will remain dormant until you desire the chemical reaction of fermentation to occur within your bread dough. This is typically a range between 33 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, once you introduce the yeast into a bread dough, you want that chemical reaction to occur. In order for the yeast to procreate and be useful in your baking recipe, it needs to be in a warm environment, specifically around 87 degrees Fahrenheit. A temperature that is too high or too low will either kill the yeast or slow down procreation. Nobody wants to kill the yeast when it is at a temperature that is too high for its survival. That would defeat the purpose of adding the yeast to your recipe in the first place. However, when the temperature is too low and procreation of the yeast is slowed, the yeast will still carry out the chemical reactions, however, it will simply take a longer period of time. This can visibly be seen by bread dough taking a longer time than required or desired in the recipe to rise. However, the slower reaction time will not greatly affect the texture of your bread, but it can actually increase the flavor in your bread, so it's not always a negative thing. Moving on with the temperamental nature of yeast, yeast can also have an effect on taste. This can occur if the dough is placed in too high of a temperature when activating the yeast, but it does not kill the yeast. This causes the yeast to overgrow and give your bread a yeasty taste. Some recipes may result in a more yeasty taste, but overall this is usually not a desired flavor. In addition, if there is added sugar in the dough or too much maltose is produced by the enzymes within the dough, this will create a large amount of energy for the yeast to use and react and grow, which can also result in the more yeasty taste. So if you're worried about the taste of your bread becoming too yeasty or not being the desired flavor that you want, be sure you let the bread rise at a temperature between 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit and don't have too much sugar within the recipe. The fermentation process of yeast creating carbon dioxide within the bread dough is the main source of texture. This is done together with the gluten content in the bread. The strength of the gluten helps the dough keep the carbon dioxide inside of the dough versus letting it escape. This overall results in the signature honeycomb-like appearance of bread inside. For example, here I have a Hawaiian bread roll, which is a little bit softer and obviously does not have as much yeast in it, which you can see this is the honeycomb-like structure. It's these very small bubbles. That's what they're talking about. Whereas with a English muffin, instead, you have these much larger holes and it's a little bit coarser as well, with evidence of the stronger gluten content and keeping that yeast inside. Hopefully you found this video extremely helpful to you in the scientific as well as visual and flavor properties of yeast within baking a loaf of bread or any other baked good. Happy cooking!